Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth Hosier, and I am the Director of Programs for the Robert H. Jackson Center. For those of you who are not familiar with the center, we are located in Jamestown, New York. We were founded in 2001, so this year we are celebrating our 25th anniversary. And we are dedicated to preserving and promoting the legacy of Justice Robert H. Jackson. He was a Supreme Court justice and the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, as well as a leading voice for the rule of law in times of crisis. Before we begin, I just want to briefly highlight a few of our other upcoming programs. On January 9th, we have two events. A virtual program that is actually going to be hosted by the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. It's part of our Nuremberg at 80 Symposium, as well as our first lecture of our 25 Years of Asking Questions series, entitled, Do We Still Believe in Free Speech? Later in January, Living Voices returns to the Jackson Center with our first program, Hear My Voice, a powerful program on women's suffrage. Then on January 30th, we have two programs again. 1A Day, a community deep dive into the First Amendment, followed by a screening of the new Nuremberg film with a talkback with author Jack L. High, whose book, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, inspired the film. For tonight's program, it is part of our Al and Marge Brown World War II lecture series, and we are pleased to welcome Cindy and Harry Handler, co-creators of the book A German Jew's Triumph, Fritz Oppenheimer, and the Denazification of Germany. Cindy is an accomplished journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and other national publications. She is the author of the book. Harry is the grandson of Fritz Oppenheimer. Drawing on his grandfather's letters, diaries, and personal history, Harry will share the family story at the heart of the book and reflect on Fritz's role during the denazification of Germany. We are honored to have both of them with us this evening. Please note that there will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go. Cindy, Harry, please take it away.
Well, thank you. I mean, the way we like to start is I'm Cindy Schweik-Handler, and Harry will tell a great story of how our family came upon these incredible original documents and contemporaneous notes, and he had great connections to professors at University of Wisconsin, where he had attended. And he went to one professor and said, I know you've, written books. Would you like to use this material and write one about my grandfather? And the professor said, it's your material. I think you should write it. And since I'm a journalist and write for a living, Harry came to me and said, this is the story. Will you write it? And I've always been fascinated by World War II stories, so I said I would love to, especially after Harry kind of framed the story as a very satisfying reversal of fortune story. So with that, I will just hand it off to Harry, and he can share the story of Fritz Oppenheimer.
Well, thank you very much. The story starts. I grew up in Central Illinois. I knew that my mother had grown up in Germany, even though they never spoke about it, except for the fact that she would speak German to her parents. There was nothing that was talked about the past. Moved to New York. It was actually taking care of my grandmother. She had a very heavy German accent, but her too, never spoke about the Nazi years. She passed away in 1993. The family gathered in her small Upper East Side apartment, trying to figure out what to do with the albums and suitcases and which were packed into the closets. The plan was to throw everything away. I said, well, I've just moved to Montclair, New Jersey. I was a history major, so I moved it from a closet in New York to a closet in Montclair. Fast forward another 10 years, a middle schooler comes to me and says, I need to write a paper on the Marshall Plan. And I said, so will you take me to the library? I said, well, I knew your grandfather worked for the State Department. Maybe we have something there. So I finally cracked open these documents, and the very first thing that came up when I looked at it, I said, "Oh my goodness, that's signed by Adolf Hitler." The thing on the left was, that's the crazy sideways signature from Hitler. The document on the right is his last political will and testament. I think one of four copies signed at 4 in the morning on April 29th, 1945. The next day, he, married his mistress, and then they, committed suicide. World War II in Europe was, due to come to an end. So I thought, this is fascinating. And why do I have these materials? Started doing some research, went back and looked at actually the Russian newsreels from, the German surrender in World War II, May 8th. And I looked on the left-hand side of the picture and said, oh, look, there's Grandpa. This is the German, high command coming back to Germany. See the small guy walking with a briefcase into the surrender. The Karlshorst where they held the surrender. I thought, I still have that briefcase. What's the story here? I read an account of the surrender, and he was this was an account written to Jack McCloy, who was the Assistant Secretary of War and a friend of Fritz Oppenheimer's, and he's writing about interrogating Field Marshal Keitel on the plane back after the surrender, and about he's going through the interrogation word by word, and about two-thirds of the way through, Field Marshal Keitel asks him, Major, how come you speak German without any accent? And I said, oh, there's got to be a story here. We also did find, hundreds, if not potentially thousands of letters. And since we're talking about, Robert Jackson and, the Nuremberg trials, I went and I pulled a few items from the letters, and, Fritz Oppenheimer, who was working on denazification at the time, said, Percy said, last week I had to go to Nuremberg to attend the trial. I watched, when General Lahosen, the first witness, broke the neck of Ribbentrop and Keitel. So I think that was the first prosecution witness. He also talked, and these are letters written, December 5th, 1945. One slightly later, while the trial is still going on, he talks about the 24 leading Nazis at Nuremberg constitutes a start, but they're also working on the restoration of property looted by the Nazis, the indemnity for the victims, code of criminal procedure, the reopening of the public courts. He was working on, many issues. And, he clearly knew Robert Jackson and Telford Taylor, who was his, assistant, pretty well. He was helping them. I think Eisenhower had sent Fritz Oppenheimer into Berlin to look for documents because they knew they were going to try the Nazis. And he said, I had to drive in a heavy snowstorm, 2 hours after my arrival, and then another car to Nuremberg, where I conferred with Chief Justice Jackson and his staff, particularly Colonel Taylor. So, in addition to opening up the courts, he was, working on the trial. Very, busy times for him. And I said, I need to go back and figure out this story. It goes back to, oops, let's see. Not sure. The story, goes back to Germany at the turn of the century. Fritz Oppenheimer was one of five children in 3 years. There were two sets of twins. There he is on the, left with his, twin Heinz. I am actually named after Heinz. That's my middle name. But I think that my grandmother, after five children in 3 years, said, that's it. We're stopping here, back off. So, that was it for the family. Germany at the time, was one of the German Empire had just come together. The map of Europe looked very different at the time. Seven major empires, all fighting for colonies, fighting for, land in Central Europe. Germany had grown very rapidly through a series of wars, very short wars, that happened usually weeks. There'd be a major battle, Germany would, often, won, and then the empire expanded. So everybody thought, each of these empires felt that they were destined to be an even bigger empire, and they were all preparing for the next war, arming rapidly. Felt there'd be a short war, and then they would be the empire of, destiny. I did look at if you went back and you looked at the films of Berlin, at the time of Germany, the very interesting thing to me is that how the military was the way up through society. People wore their uniforms to walk on the streets. They wore their uniforms to the cafes. It was a very militaristic society. It was also a time where it was, if there were countries in Europe where it was okay to be Jewish, there was anti-Semitism, everywhere. But probably Germany was the best country to be of Jewish, descent in Europe. There was an aristocratic set of Germans who grew up. This is the house that my mother grew up in. It was a law office on the first floor. Family lived on the second floor. You can see my great grandmother on the balcony, and they rented out the third floor. So this, very nice house was right by the Tiergarten in Berlin. History all of a sudden changed in, 1914. There were four Serbian nationalists who decided to assassinate the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. They failed in their initial attempt, but while the Archduke, his driver, turned down a side street to visit the people who'd been injured in the hospital, one of the conspirators, happened to be on the street with his gun. He shot the Archduke and his wife, both of which, died. And very quickly, this was the match that lit the tinderbox, which was Europe at the time. Fascinating thing to watch the newsreels of people going off to war in 1914 is how enthusiastic everybody was about going to war. It looks like the beginning of a marathon in New York City. People are wearing flowers, coming out of their helmets. Civilians are marching alongside, waving their flags. People are smiling. They feel there's going to be a short war. They will be the winners, and then they will be living in the empire of destiny. Fritz Oppenheimer at the time was too young to go. He volunteered, at 16 and joined up at 17, which is the very fastest that he could, join. There he is on the left. You can see him, tiny teenage soldier trying to grow a mustache. His boots go over his knees. The very first battle that he's in is the Battle of Verdun. There are 750,000 casualties, 300,000 dead, and no territorial gain for either side. Germans gained a few miles at the beginning of the battle. French took it back, when the battle was over after, 9 months. The lines really had not moved. So 750,000 hurt, 300,000 dead, no difference in the, to the battle. Fritz Oppenheimer fought through the entire World War I, was a Battle of the Somme, most of the major battles on the Western Front, transferred to the Eastern Front, survived a Cossack charge, typhus, fought, was seriously wounded 4 times. And, but finally at the end of the war, he was still fighting for, Germany. He won an Iron Cross at Verdun. And 2 weeks before the armistice, at the very end, he's still emptying his machine gun at at the British troops while the other Germans are surrendering, for which he wins his second Iron Cross for valor. War ends. Germany is a mess. The Allies are don't want to see another war in Central Europe. Germany is assigned the blame, has to pay reparations, and loses territory with approximately 5 million of their inhabitants. So even though it was an armistice, the Allies really declared them the the losers, and the Germans, the humiliation of Versailles really drove their politics for the next 20 years. Fritz Oppenheimer, very quickly, goes to graduates college, goes to law school. At the time, this is, I think, is a generation beyond where you were supposed to marry. It was an economic transaction and an arranged marriage. Here, people of the same background, aristocrats, were, introduced to each other at dinners or, parties. And then they were supposed to marry within that group. Fritz Oppenheimer, they were an aristocratic family from Berlin, married Elspeth Kaula. She came from a merchant family in the South, but also that was her father. Her mother was part of the Warburg banking family. So it was a fairly aristocratic marriage. They marry in 1927, very quickly have, a daughter, and then another daughter, my mother, comes along. Fritz Oppenheimer, I think, clearly has PTSD from World War I. He misses my mother's birth because he's hot air ballooning. I think he felt like the need to always live life at the extremes. No, I'm not sure if it was World War I or it's just his personality. Uh, in 1931, while the German economy is falling apart, my grandmother takes the eldest daughter to Stuttgart to go to her father's birthday. Daughter is tired, wants to go home. They take a car home. She gets out of the car and is struck by another car, never regains consciousness, and is buried in Berlin. My grandmother writes, Elspeth Oppenheimer will never be able to be truly happy ever again. And this is Baum's gravesite by the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. It was a terrible time. Most marriages, it's difficult for them to survive the death of a child, but also, the German economy is falling apart. Fritz Oppenheimer is working while his wife grieves. At the time, Adolf Hitler, who had been part of a fringe right-wing party, their slogan was "One people, one empire, one leader." So only he could fix the problems of Germany. Germany had actually been recovering from the inflation. Their economy was doing better. But in many ways, it was because of, based on loans that come from America. As the Great Depression started, America called in the loans, and Germany's economy fell into, a horrible, set of unemployment. Hitler, wins approximately a third of the vote in 1933. President von Hindenburg appoints him chancellor as part of a coalition government. They feel that Hitler's, somewhat of a lunatic, but at least he'll be controlled by his coalition partners. A week after, or sorry, a month after Hitler comes to power, the Reichstag mysteriously burns. This is the German capital. Um, the Nazis immediately say an insurrection is starting. It's a communist insurrection because they found a mentally ill Dutch person wandering near the Reichstag. And as Joseph Goebbels, had said at the time, he said, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will come to believe it. Which was, exactly what they did about the Reichstag fire. Um, Very quickly thereafter, the communists are put in. This is the beginning of concentration camps at the time. Socialists are banned from coming into the Reichstag to vote, and the remaining politicians vote to give Hitler dictatorial powers. Jews immediately they lose the ability to be judges, to practice law, to practice medicine. Um, but if you are a World War I veteran, you could apply to get your licenses back. The fascinating thing, and because nobody spoke about it, I always assumed that our family, Hitler came to power in 1933. The family left, and went to Holland like Anne Frank's family did. It turns out, and we discovered these papers in the German archives, that Fritz Oppenheimer was not fighting to leave Germany. They were fighting to stay. These are, documents of him, saying as I fought loyally in World War I, I'm not a communist. He found generals and ambassadors and ministers to vouch for him, and they give him his law license back. So he practices, as an international lawyer in Berlin until 1936, when it's very, clear the Nuremberg laws have been written, and the Nazis waited until after the Olympics in after the Olympics in 1936. Then they started enforcing the Nuremberg laws, and it became clear to Fritz Oppenheimer that they needed to leave. In 1937, my mother, where they were told to go to bed in their, best clothes. They took they weren't allowed to take any money out of Germany, so they were a wealthy family, and after they left, they were a poor family, and they really remained poor for the rest of their lives. They did take art off the walls, put it into my mother, who was 9 at the time, her portfolio. They crossed the border into to Holland. And, it's interesting, my mother was actually, almost exactly the same age as Anne Frank. If you look at the pictures, they really kind of, look like each other. And, they both fled to Holland. My family went on from Holland to London in the years afterwards. And so they lived. Fritz Oppenheimer, was working on trying to set up a practice in London, but he continued to practice law in Germany with an Aryan partner who was he was the beard. He kind of represented the firm, even though Fritz Oppenheimer was doing the work. And this went on until 1938. Goebbels and Hitler had promised that Berlin would be Judenfrei, or Jew-free, in 1938. The Gestapo, finally came. His partner let him know that the Gestapo was looking for them. There, you can see them on in the left, wearing their Hugo Boss designed uniforms. That's, Hugo Boss's first commission was to design the Gestapo uniforms. Flees across to the border. Different set of Gestapo take him off the train, interrogate him for 5 hours. He pulls his, indignant lawyers act. And so they take his papers, take his passport, and he walks over the border, now stateless, and into Holland. Um, Hitler wanted to go back to war. They wanted to, make up everything that they had lost at Versailles. One thing which I thought was interesting to see is, what was his excuse for going back to war again? What was the rationale for the German people? And it's because there were German speakers in states outside of Germany. And it's very interesting to look at his language about why they needed to, have another war, was to get back the German speakers. And if you look at what Vladimir Putin wrote, before he started the war in Ukraine, same reason, he needs to defend the Russian speakers. Find it very interesting. I have Russian-speaking relatives who live in New Jersey. It doesn't mean that New Jersey needs to be part of the Soviet Union, but that's the rationale. Could the Allies have stopped Hitler, in the 30s, and prevented World War II? Absolutely, they could have. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 36. He had 2 divisions. The Allies had 10. They just couldn't believe that they were going to have to go back to war again so soon after World War I, where 10 million people had died. In 38, Hitler wants to take Austria. The Austrian chancellor says, well, we'll have a plebiscite and let the people decide. Hitler knew he would lose, so he sent in the army and took over Austria. Then he's looking to take over the Sudeten part of Czechoslovakia. They have a conference with the French and the British. Chamberlain famously says there will be peace in our time, waves a piece of paper. Hitler marches into Czechoslovakia, but Hitler and the neighboring countries, divide it up so they don't take the Sudetenland, they take the whole country. The Allies still felt, the British and French felt, at least, we still have the Russians on our side, but in August 1939, the Nazis and the Russians, they double-crossed the Allies and signed a non-aggression pact. The very next week, Hitler invades Poland. And the interesting thing is World War I was a war to really spread German culture, to make them the dominant empire. In this case, this was not a war of culture. This was a war of annihilation. Hitler said our strength is in our quickness and our brutality. Little happens he takes Poland in, 6 weeks. After a few weeks, the officer corps and the intellectuals flee to the eastern side of, Poland. The Russians then invade, they double crossed the Poles and invaded from the east, took the officer corps and the intellectuals captive, held them captive for a few months, and then murdered them all. And they were buried in Khitan Forest. England and France did declare war on Germany, but very little happened, until May 1940. Hitler invaded Holland, France, which fought for 4 years and really won in World War One, falls in 5 weeks. Everybody, the world is shocked. They cannot figure out why these countries fell so quickly, and the feeling was is that there must be a fifth column. The German refugees must have been still supporting Germany. England is very concerned about this because they know that they're next, and England interned their immigrants. So German and Italians, people who had fled the fascists, were now being interned by the English. Fritz Oppenheimer realizes it's time to leave. Many people applied to get into the United States at the time. I think 95 to 99% of the applications were turned down. My family was accepted. Fritz Oppenheimer had connections. Family is loaded on a convoy to sail to Boston. They're attacked by U-boats. My family, Fritz Oppenheimer's not with them, but grandmother and uncle go up on the top of the deck. They're struck. They watch 3 boats in the convoy go down. They cannot go back and rescue, their ship cannot go back and rescue the refugees in the water. They have to leave them there to die. And her boat sails to Boston, which I think is another reason why there was no German spoke in my house after that. Fritz Oppenheimer stays to get his barrister degree in London. The Germans launch air attacks. Churchill famously writes, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much been owed by so many to so few," because the British Air Force was able to fight the Luftwaffe to a draw. Fritz Oppenheimer at the time, who'd been very depressed about being, so, remote, writes, "I live more intensely than ever. The sense and awareness of possible losses sharpens one's beauty of this world, deepens one's gratitude for being able to experience this life." So he actually, and I think that was part of his personality, needed to, live at a certain adrenaline level. Um, so he, did not mind being under bomb attack. I think he actually found it exciting. But he did realize that he was not going to get his barrister degree. He sailed for the United States to very difficult to get jobs, could not practice law. Pearl Harbor was attacked. Japanese, who were living on the West Coast were interned as the British did. They were rounded up and put in camps in in California. Good question was what was going to happen to the Germans because Germany had declared war on the United States too. So the United States was at war with them too. Big question was would the Germans be, interned as well? But they made a decision, and I think it's the same Jack McCloy, who was by now, I think, the Assistant Secretary of War. They decided to call the Germans would be enemy aliens in the United States, meant no travel, could not have a camera, no legal work, and they lived in a two-room apartment in Queens. I think it was very depressing for Fritz Oppenheimer. It's interesting to look at the pictures of him since he left Germany. Not one will he look at the camera. He's trying to get into the United States Army at the time. He's 45. The maximum age is 38. Finally, in 43, they raised the age limit to 45. He immediately enlists. My grandmother writes, "We have a home. Our family outran the claws of the Nazis, and the children seem to be on the correct path to be good Americans. But for you, the straight and narrow path has no attraction when there's a world war and Hitler's power seems unshrinkable. Will your poor eyes, your age, and your status as an enemy alien keep you from once more going to war? Not possible." So there he is, age 45. He is blind in an eye from shrapnel in World War I. Can't really see, but here he is off, Private Oppenheimer off to basic training. And at the time that he went, if you look at the map of Europe, the Nazis had really won. They're a third of the way into Russia. There's a couple of white spots on the map, which were neutral countries, but they were really either fascists or allies of the Nazis. So really, the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union stood alone against the Nazis. At the time, I think when they started sending Jews out of Germany, they really meant to take their fortune and to take the money for rearmament. Now, since they had all of Europe, there were millions of Jews who lived, particularly in the East. And Hitler had said in a speech in 39, nobody really took him seriously at the time, that if there's another world war, will result in the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. And, in the 1941, they set out to do it. They set up death camps, murder factories, deported the Jews, and by the time they got to 1945, 6 million Jews had died. Finally, in 42, though, and 43, the tide starts to turn. Hitler tries to take Stalingrad, where he sacrifices a whole army trying to take the city that's the namesake of his rival. The British finally, halt the Germans who are heading towards the Suez Canal in North Africa. Field Marshal Montgomery is appointed, and at the Battle of El Alamein, they turned the tide. Fritz Oppenheimer graduates from, first he goes to, but graduates from basic training at the time, and it just goes to show how we treat immigrants now versus then. If you passed basic training and were declared a good American, not only you, but your entire family got American citizenship. So they were finally no longer stateless. Fritz Oppenheimer goes to officer candidate school. Graduates, and they figure out that here is an international lawyer. He speaks 8 languages. Friends with Jack McCloy, who's the Assistant Secretary of War, decide to assign him to General Eisenhower's headquarters in England, where they're working on the invasion of Europe. There you can see a picture from Eisenhower signed to Major Oppenheimer at the bottom. At the time, the biggest secret in the world was, where will the Allies invade? Will it be Norway? Will it be the Pas de Calais? Will it be Normandy? Fritz Oppenheimer walks into Eisenhower's headquarters. He's 46. He's bespectacled. He has a German accent. People are a little suspicious of him. He goes out they send him back to London. He works on the handbook for military government until he can work his way back into, their good graces. So they trust him. And the same people who didn't trust him at the very beginning actually became his very good friends. June 6th, 1944, General Eisenhower says, "The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." Fritz Oppenheimer would have rather been, with a gun, walking onto the beaches. Just incredible courage if you go to the Normandy beaches to watch what those soldiers had to go through. But they do get onto the to the beaches very quickly, kind of contained in a uh, close in until the Allies flattened the French towns near them. They flattened the town of Caen and gradually broke out into Europe. The Allies think that now the Nazis will fall, that they'll take Berlin. They're hoping that the war will be over by Christmas. The fear is, and this is a fear that Eisenhower had and most of the Allies had, is that Hitler, and you can see on the left there he is with his mistress in the Bavarian Alps, that the government would move to the south, and then the war would go on for years. The fear was that the Allies would then break apart. If you look in the center, that's Eisenhower's map room. The behind his desk, and this is where they signed the surrender, is the map of the National Redoubt. So now, the worry is, that the Russians are coming in from the east, the Allies are coming in from the west, and will the Nazis evacuate down to the south? A lot of questions about, whether there was a plan. They have ended up not going. Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. What had happened? Why wasn't there an evacuation to the south, even though that some went? And, it turns out that there was an evacuation plan. It had been, we went to the topography of terror in Berlin, and the historian who had just written a book on the last days of the Nazi, so, I said, it's like, "Oh, look what we have." And he says, "Oh, that's the evacuation plan. We've been looking for that. This is Project Thusnelda." It's been there's always a mystery in history about where this was, and it turns out it had been sitting in Montclair, New Jersey, all these years. So we have it, but it's going to the probably the World War II museum in just a little bit. Finally, April 29th, 1945, again, Martin Bormann writes, "Because the future of our divisions and our position appears hopeless, the Fuhrer dictated last night the attached political testament. He appoints a new, government because he's going to commit suicide." And did he learn anything, as he wrote in his last political will and testament? Not a thing. He calls upon the nation to fight mercilessly against the poisoners of all people of the world, international Jewry. Then, there's the crazy sideways signature, 4 in the morning on April 29th, 1945. He signs it. Next day, he and his mistress state that they're pure Aryans. Uh, she wants to be a beautiful corpse, so she takes poison. He takes poison and shoots himself in the head. And, the war in Europe is coming to an end. Fritz Oppenheimer, who has been deep in the mines of Germany looking for German scientific secrets, comes back to Eisenhower's headquarters. I don't think he slept for weeks. He's translating the surrender documents. They're working on them. The Germans come and they sign the surrender on May 7th, 1945. There they are, the Americans, the British, and the Russians. Joseph Stalin is furious. He demands a do-over. He says, "I just killed 1 million people to take Berlin, and we're going to do the surrender again there." Eisenhower says, "That's fine." Stalin actually had a point because the Germans, they signed the surrender in World War I in France. Many people said that they never really surrendered on their own territory. So Eisenhower says that's fine. He calls, Fritz Oppenheimer and his, series of generals and staff to fly to Berlin. So here you see that's Field Marshal Keitel standing with his baton, Admiral von Friedeberg stepping off the airplane steps. The head of the Luftwaffe, Stumpf, is getting onto the ladder, and behind them is Fritz Oppenheimer, returning to Berlin 7 years after he was chased out by the Gestapo. So back to the newsreel, of the Russians. There's Fritz Oppenheimer walking. He's the short guy with a briefcase on the left, accompanying the Nazis as they come off the plane. There he is with the surrender documents, walking into the headquarters. They negotiate with the Russians. The Russians wants the documents changed, slightly, so it'll be their surrender. So they work on it. It's supposed to happen May 8th, but it gets into the next morning, May 9th, which is why you see Victory Day in Russia. They're up on Lenin's tomb. It's always, May 9th. The Nazis come in. The arrogant Keitel shows his field marshal's baton, says, "Okay, bring me the surrender documents, and I'll sign." Marshal Zhukov, the Russian, says, "No, I'm not going to bring them to you. You come to me." So the Nazis go over to the table where the Russians are. There's Fritz Oppenheimer, gives him his pen. He shows Keitel where to sign. Uh, all the generals and admirals sign, and then you know 20 minutes later, it's all over. That's the remarkable reversal of fortune. So many, German Jews were deported, killed, fled, lost everything. The surrender was signed with Fritz Oppenheimer's pen and everybody's looking for the pen. The Russians kept it, but he was sitting right across from him. And then he takes the German generals back to Flensburg. On the plane back, Keitel says, "Major, how come you speak German without any accent?" And this is an account that Fritz Oppenheimer wrote to the Assistant Secretary of War, Jack McCloy. It says, "I was tempted to rub it in and tell him frankly that I was born in Berlin, had fought on his side in the Prussian field artillery, through all the battles. Then the Nazis kicked me out. I immigrated to the United States, volunteered as a private in the U.S. Army. And now, as a commissioned officer, I had this miraculously fine assignment to watch him sign the unconditional surrender and to guard him on the journey back." He said, "But after second thought, I'd be more in line with the intentions of General Eisenhower to camouflage the truth and reply simply, the American schools are excellent." So Fritz Oppenheimer, he kind of he gets his reversal of fortune. He gets his the tables have turned. He wants to go home. His wife wants to go home, but the Americans want to go home. But Europe is a mess. 5 million ethnic Germans have been expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The slave laborers try to go home back to their homes, but it's really been stolen by, their neighbors. Then many times they're pogroms again, and they have to turn around and go back to Germany. Um, Europe is on the move. People are starving. Germany is completely fallen apart, and Fritz Oppenheimer is too valuable as a lawyer to be dismissed from the army, so he stays. The Admiral von Friedeberg commits suicide. Keitel, and the others are arrested. Fritz Oppenheimer goes back to Berlin. He's sent by Schaeff. His house. He goes and visits the location of his old house. There he is, very happily standing with his pistol on the rubble. The only thing standing is the ironwork from the doorway. Um, and he goes into Gestapo headquarters, steals Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer of the SS, the Gestapo, his personal stationery. It's hard to see, but he writes as the tagline, the purpose is the denazification of Germany. And he said, "I called at the offices of the modern Nero, but not like so many of his poorest victims to be tortured to death. Well armed, without knocking at any door, which if still existing was widely open, I saw the ruins of what was formerly worse than Dante's Inferno and uncovered this hideous letter paper. How often such paper must have been used for orders by the Gestapo to liquidate human beings. The modern medieval age in Germany is over, and this is proof of the final defeat of Nazism. The task ahead is arduous, but less frightful and horrible. Then August 17th, Victory Day, the Solicitor General actually gives him his car. He visits his daughter's grave and then Hitler's bunker, where he picks up some of the souvenirs and probably many of the things which we're donating to museums now. Said, but I managed to get a little memory of this beast of men. He does stay to denazify Germany. His job is to, help try the leading Nazis to reestablish the court system. You do wonder when the society was so thoroughly Nazified, you needed to be the member of the Nazi Party to be a judge. Who did they find to reopen the courts? And Fritz Oppenheimer found his wife's cousin, who was a Christian politician, became the minister president. His law professor became the justice minister. Here he is, helping to swear in the new German, judiciary. It's very interesting. The American colonel in the center gives the speech. Fritz Oppenheimer, reads it in German on the other side. He needed to keep his origin story secret, which is why I think all these things stayed secret for so long. Because the Germans had said if we lose this war, the Jews will come back and govern us, and so he really needed to keep his background quiet. They did, and he worked, very hard on helping to prepare for the Nuremberg trials. They took the top Nazis and tried them. Interesting to see the Nuremberg laws. If you go back to the National Archives, you can see his handwriting deciding which Nuremberg laws to keep, which ones to modify, which ones to abrogate. So remarkable turnabout that the Nuremberg laws sent him out, and then he got to rewrite them. Finally, in March of '46. He's given the Bronze Star by Eisenhower. He helps to negotiate the law for liberation from National Socialism and militarism. Given the Legion of Merit, promoted to lieutenant colonel, and then goes home. After Nuremberg, Keitel is hanged, along with a number of the other leading Nazis. Fritz Oppenheimer goes back, hopes to practice law. The Germans give him his law license back. The British make him a barrister. The New York bar says, no, you have to go back and go to law school again and start from scratch. So he says, I need to earn some money. Goes to work for the State Department. There you can see a nice letter from George Marshall. Did work on the Marshall Plan. On the right, you can see him at the Council of Foreign Ministers with Secretary of State Dean Acheson. In his late 50s, as with many people who'd been in combat for so much of his life, he smoked when he was in the army, not when he was out of it, starts having heart attacks. The doctors tell him, you must rest, Mr. Oppenheimer, or you will die. He said, that's fine. You can see him coming out of a yurt in Mongolia, panning for gold in Alaska. Decides to go on a safari in Tanzania, comes to visit us, for the last time at our house in Urbana, Illinois, then heads off to Africa. Falls in a pit in Tanzania, has heart attack number 7 or 8, passes away in Nairobi, and his ashes are spread over the plains of the Serengeti. So what have we learned, about Fritz Oppenheimer personally? Is really a rare reversal of fortune story. Interesting to get to know him, through the letters and documents. He really was a towering personality in a 5'3" frame. I thought it was fascinating that he was a perpetual outsider, a Jew in the German army, a German in the U.S. Army, and then a U.S. officer in occupied Germany. So he always had to keep his background silent. he did have, there it's difficult to do that. He had a deep desire to be at the center of world events. It took him away from his family for years. He was not a family man. What does it mean to us? We started on this book, earlier. I would say now it's even become a little bit more frightening to watch the rise of totalitarianism in Germany versus today. You really get the feeling that democracy is constantly under threat. Authoritarianism is rising again, throughout the world, Russia, China, elsewhere, here. Belief in the rule of law, it's not enough to say you believe in the rule of law. It really depends on an equal, a fair application of justice, much more than the rule of law. And it's good to have Plan B. Germany took away our my mother's citizenship. If the Nazis took it away, the Germans give it back, and so I and my children are European citizens. Question is how strong is democracy, throughout the world? I think it's an open question, but certainly a lot to learn. We're happy to share the story. I think it's a this one it was very exciting for us to write it because so many stories about World War II are just hard to read, and it's a series of losses, and this is with losses, but with gains at the end. So it's nice to tell the story. We have many more stories in it. We hope you get the book. I think there's a link through the website also. It's actually even a little less expensive on Amazon, but a lot more stories in the book. So we'll hope you get a chance to look at those. And now Cindy and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, he's fascinating life.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
yeah, make sure if you have any questions, the chat's open, the Q&A section is open, so drop any questions that you have in there. As people start maybe dropping some questions in, I just want to briefly remind you all that the Al and Marge Brown World War II lecture is endowed by Phil and Mary Ann Zimmer. And it, like all of the programs for the Jackson Center, is offered free, completely free of charge, thanks to the generosity of our donors and supporters. I'm just going to pop my screen back on here. So I just wanted to say that donations of any amount help keep the center operating and ensure that our programs remain accessible to all of you, and that you can support the center by scanning the QR code on the screen or visiting roberthjackson.org/donate. So let's see, does anybody drop any questions here?
There is a question from Kristen McMahon. What lessons have you taken from his life? That's a great question. I'll go first and then Harry can go. I learned so much. I think it just the aspect that Harry mentioned at the end about Plan B, just to always have your eyes open and think about the way events can turn, and be prepared as much as you can for for what might happen. He did that by he had very strong connections with American clients like the American Chamber of Commerce. I think they were the entity that gave his family permission. It was through them that they came to America. Harry?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things to be learned from the story. I was shocked to just when you read some of the letters and you start to feel what they learned contemporaneously and how to respond. He knew he needed to stand up. There was so many people just looked and said, as we got out of here, now I'm fine. He felt very strongly that he had to go back and and fight again. And you know, it's sad that they had to kind of keep their keep the story so quiet, that they had to do it. I do remember because I didn't know my grandfather well, nobody spoke about these things, that my grandmother took me to a lecture with Jack McCloy, at the time, and I think I was 13, and he looked down and said, "Oh, I knew your grandmother. He was a great man." So it's nice to hear that, nice to hear that story, and that's what he did for standing up for it. But, tremendous sacrifices to do it. You could see that, you read from the letters too that they were very disappointed that he was gone so long and they wanted him to come home. So you need to make sacrifices to be on the world stage like that.
Um, if I may, there's another question from Regina Cases. I've read that many of the former Nazis given jail sentences in Germany were released early because German society lost the taste for punishment. Did Fritz ever comment on this?
Go ahead.
Well, I guess I was looking for just from the correspondence that I got to use in writing the book. I think, well, our sense is that he had known, he felt that he and the people who he knew were kind of the good Germans, that they were out there, and the Nazis were kind of like the imposters. Denazification I know was very controversial because, the Americans wanted to go home and they did not want to occupy that country forever. And they were there for, I think, a year, or Fritz was there for a year, but gradually wanted to leave. So the desire was to transfer self-governance to the Germans, and it was hard because you had to have some people operating that country. And my sense is that they arrived on a system whereby you were punished for the act that you committed as opposed to being a member of the Nazi Party. If you were responsible for rounding people up or you murdered anyone, you were going to be punished for that. And I guess I don't know. I think that the Germans really resented the idea of collective guilt, and it was very difficult to get justice there. But I think that's what they arrived at.
Yeah, exactly said. The denazification effort was, the Germans naturally, in general, didn't like asking questionnaires. They just wanted to move on, and honestly, they were just, looking for food. Sometimes so much of Germany had been destroyed. There were 5 million new residents there. Um, I think they said, as we want to try the top people, the trials went on for, first they did the top Nazis, then they did, the SS officers, but then, it really became, up to the next generation to prosecute the Nazis. And, I think everybody had different feelings, about it, but the sentences, the fact that they only tried 24 in the top trial was not that many. And I think people are shocked about that. But looking at it, with the benefit of history, I will answer the question about Oppenheimer bomb. No, we were not related to, Robert Oppenheimer. Jews were given the name of the town that they came from in I think, the 1700s. So Fritz Oppenheimer meant Fred from the town of Oppenheim. So the Oppenheimers were here earlier. Everybody asked the question. I found
Yeah,
lots of letters you related to the Oppenheimer of the bomb, but we were not.
as far as we know. Um, Karen, wonder asks, I heard that one of the challenges in prosecuting war criminals in Germany was that there was no law covering genocide as opposed to murder. Can you comment on this? That's really interesting.
So I think I know part of the answer to that, crimes against humanity, that was really Robert F. Jackson. He was some of the, crimes against humanity and illegally starting the war was the legal strategy that, under Jackson and Telford Taylor, Fritz Oppenheimer helped with it too. It was a novel legal strategy at the time. And, it has become the basis of the International Court at of The Hague, and others have been charged with genocide and crimes against humanity. But this was really the beginning of it. And it came from Robert. Certainly, the author, I think, was considered to be Robert Jackson.
I think the term genocide first came about in 1933 by Raphael Lemkin, who was a judge, a Jewish judge. So it didn't really kind of come about until after things were already kind of going on in Germany.
Had people been tried for genocide before, or is this a
I think war crimes had been people had been tried
Right,
for war crimes, not
right.
individuals, like kind of the crime of war crimes had happened, right? But the Nuremberg was the first time individuals had been held accountable for these things.
Right.
That
And
was
as being
the
guilty of
Revolutionary
crimes
War.
against humanity.
Crimes
Right.
against humanity,
Right.
crimes against peace, those were new crimes invented for the Nuremberg trials.
Wow, that's really interesting. Wow. I should add just thank you for mentioning about the book too. I think the most cost-effective way is just like on Amazon, to be honest. But so I'd like to throw that in there
There
for
is
anybody's
a
interested.
question in the chat as well. It says, "What is the fate of Fritz's siblings and parents after 1933?"
Well, I can answer that. So, my mother, Ingrid Oppenheimer, became, she changed her name to Ellen, which as soon as she came here, it was kind of interesting. The family wrote in German right up until the war started, and then immediately switched to English. They really had no money. She went to Vassar on a scholarship, then went to the University of Chicago on a scholarship, met a young physics professor, Paul Handler from Newark, New Jersey. They moved to Urbana, Illinois, where he was a physics professor. She was a sociology professor, and really stayed there for boy, 30, 40 years. So a very, very long time in Urbana, Illinois. My father passed away, a little young. My mother moved out to be, with us in New Jersey. Her brother, Ernie Oppenheimer, got his psychology degree from Columbia. Kind of became a hippie, after he did some I think he taught at Auburn for a while, started a community college in Tucson, Arizona. It was very close to him. People in the family tended not to live that long. Fritz Oppenheimer died at 68. Heinz, who I'm named after, I think died at 54. My uncle died at 56. All of cancer. So they've all passed away now too, but they did, live life as Americans after the
Yeah,
after the
I
war.
should say Fritz's siblings and well, his mother died in England, I think, right? Wasn't it?
No,
Or,
Elspeth's mother died in England.
oh, right, right, right. Sorry. Oh, right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, sorry. Fritz's mother was the first to come to America, I believe, and eventually he had four siblings, and they all came, and they were all professionals. But it was very hard for most of them to begin again. I think like his sister was married to kind of like an industrialist, and they did well. I mean, he kind of, he was a businessman. He did well. Fritz's twin was an engineer and he had an interesting life in Europe before he left, but I don't think really established himself as much when he got over here. Another one was a doctor, but he was kind of like an alcoholic. He wasn't really a great doctor. So it's difficult to start over.
Yeah. I will say, yeah, there's links. It is sold at independent, bookshops. I'll distribute the link later. McFarland, our publisher, too. Also, we can send around the link. Just small
Yeah,
publisher.
Mhm.
yeah, it's in there.
Great.
Um,
Well, thank you guys so much. And for those of you who are tuned in, we also are recording this, so we'll be able to also put it up on our YouTube as well if anybody missed any of it. So thank you both so much for joining us.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure. We
It was a
really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.